Hello, I'm Melissa Idris, and with me today I have Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is a Professor of Economics at Nehru University in India. She's also the Executive Secretary of International Development Economics Associates, or IDEA, which is an international network of heterodox development economists. And very exciting to have you here. You're in town for the Khazanah Megatrends 2019, speaking about growth and development. So thank you so much for taking time off to be on the show today.
It's a pleasure.
So you're known as the feminist economist for your feminist economics. And I want to talk to you about that first off, because I think that economics has made very little progress over the years in closing the gender gap. And this is important to look at because given the field's prominence in determining public policy, we should be addressing this issue. So I want to get your thoughts on that. Do you think there is a gender gap or gender bias in economic policy?
Absolutely. I think a lot of economic policy is completely gender blind, and that has all kinds of implications in terms of unintended effects, or sometimes, in fact, in not achieving your planned goals, or not even identifying the problem properly.
Right.
So there are lots of ways in which economies lose out because of the bias of economic policies. But in fact, the discipline of economics also has a very big gender gap.
Right,
and
that means not enough female economists?
And, well, let me put it this way, there's not enough diversity in general.
Okay.
If you look at prominent economists, very few women, very few people from different backgrounds, whether ethnic or in India caste. Globally, it's dominated by the North Atlantic rather than developing countries. All of this matters because it affects the questions people ask, it affects the methodologies they use for the answers, and it affects the results. So in a way, we lose. There have been lots of discussions at the Megatrends Forum about how diversity is really important to advance human knowledge. It's not just enough to have really smart, bright people, but if they're all the same, they're not going to be as good at innovating, inventing, discovering new things.
So just to touch a little bit on that, about gender diversity in economics, I read something that was really interesting. Research by Mohsin Javdani as well as Hajun Chang found that female economists exhibit less ideological bias compared to their male counterparts, and they're able to set aside their biases based on their experiences. So that tells me that perhaps male economists are very set in their ways, and you might not get a lot of change in economic thinking through male economists.
Yes, well, I won't say all men, but certainly, yeah, and the dominant tendency in mainstream economics is this very alpha male kind of approach, which is that we know, we've got it, we've understood it, and you don't really have much to teach me.
So has it gotten better, in recent years? I mean, has economic policy seen its Me Too time's up moment?
Not enough.
Okay.
It's getting better slowly, but there's still a lot of open and sometimes very latent and implicit discrimination. I think there are some lucky ones like me. We managed to be successful. We kind of slipped through the cracks. But there are lots of very bright young women who either get depressed or discouraged early on, and who are, even when they have very insightful kinds of research and so on, they don't get the credit and they don't get the recognition that they deserve.
How do we encourage or incorporate more diversity in economic policy making?
One very important thing, of course, is to have more women economists in the first place who are actually actively engaged in policy. Another is, in fact, in governments, because there's really not enough representation of women in governments. And I find that this is one of those cases where numbers matter. It's not enough to have the token woman. Because you end up having to behave like a man. And I've been the token woman long enough to know that. So
too many manuals, is it?
Exactly. You really need to have more and more women also in economic decision making at different levels. And I think that's, when there are enough of them, you can change the culture of an organization, the approach, the economic perspectives you bring. And I think that's absolutely essential.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the public value of care and the politics of women's work, because care services, I mean, for years, decades, historically has been taken for granted. It's unrecognized, and almost, I guess, the unsung heroes in all societies. It cuts across, doesn't it? But talk to me about the public value of that, one that's often not taken into account in a national development.
Absolutely. You know exactly what you said, that so much of care work is actually performed by women who are unpaid within households or communities, or underpaid by communities. Because once you have this paid to unpaid spectrum, then two things happen. One is that the work itself gets undervalued because so much of it is done for free. And then those who do that free work, anything where they go for paid work gets underpaid.
Right.
And that kind of wage penalty, we find, extends into all care activities, which are typically not seen as skilled, even though some of them require a lot of skill. Like looking after the young, we know that there's a lot involved in nursery training and in all of that. Preschool training, looking after the old, geriatric training, it's actually quite specialized. We don't give it any value. We think it can be done by unpaid women working at home. Whereas, in fact, then when you do provide the paid services, the people who do those paid services also get paid very little.
Right, they're underpaid. So what kind of structural issues have allowed for this to kind of perpetuate over the years?
Essentially, the one-line answer is patriarchy. Basically, it's the gender construction of society. It's the whole idea that women's place is to look after people, and that we are more caring, loving, compassionate, and we'll do it. And when that whole responsibility is put on you, and when young girls are socialized from very early on that this is really their role in society, it's really hard to break. And of course, it's very convenient, not just for men, but for the economy, because this is actually providing a massive subsidy to the formal economy. All this unpaid work, it provides a subsidy in two ways. One is that you're getting all this, the whole economy is getting a lot of this work done for free. Another is that, when you have crises, when you want the fiscal adjustment, when governments want to cut down, somebody has to keep doing this work. So the burden shifts to households. So you know that there is this household available for you to actually push around and be flexible.
Okay.
So governments use that to actually cope with the business cycle. The burden is borne by women in households.
Is this, a developing country issue, or does it cut across all countries?
To some extent, it cuts across all countries. We know that in Europe, in the Eurozone crisis, when they cut back on a lot of the public services that they provided, it was women who actually had to deal with all of that extra burden of work. But in developing countries, it's really extreme. And it's structural. It's not just over a business cycle. It's something systemic.
Okay. All right. We're going to come back and continue our conversation with Prof. Jayati after this. Stay tuned. Thanks for staying with us on Astro AWANI. I'm Melissa Idris. With me, Professor Jayati Ghosh of Nehru University. Now we're talking about the value of care work. So, Professor, you were in town as well for the launch of Khazanah Research Institute's report on this. Now, talk to me about how you understand the Malaysian context to be when it comes to the public value of care work.
So I'm really proud to actually have been associated even marginally with this report, because I think it's excellent. They've done a time use survey in Kuala Lumpur. Obviously, it isn't very large because you don't have the resources, but I think this could become an impetus even for the national statistical system to take it up and do a time use survey, which they're going to lobby for. Why is that important? Because it shows that there's so much of unpaid work in care in Malaysia, which is often not recognized at all. And in fact, the extent of it is quite startling. And this is done not just by women who are at home and not doing anything else, but it's done by working women who also have to do extra work back home, the double burden, as it's called. Okay. And the importance of this is that if you really want to do anything about it in public policy, you have to first recognize it. recognize it exists, how much of it there is, how much it contributes. So time use surveys play a very important role in recognizing that the care work that is actually done. Because then you actually know what people are doing, you're able to identify the different blocks and say, well, these are the things we can do something about. Because in fact, when we talk about dealing with care, I basically propose the 5 R's. Recognize, reduce the bits that you can reduce, which are unnecessary and drudgery, and maybe mechanical things can replace it. You know, like grinding spices or things like that.
I see, okay.
Yeah. Washing machines instead of hand washing, you know, things like that. Redistribute, and the redistribution occurs between society, that is the government, private provision, and households, and within households, men and women. Redistribute at all levels, right? The 4th R, reward. Actually pay care workers properly in terms of the actual value they provide to society. Instead of saying, oh, you know, she's just looking after old people and doesn't deserve much. Recognize that this is an immensely important activity which massively increases human welfare. Reward care workers properly. And finally, represent. Allow them a voice in the policy making.
So have you seen good policy come out based on these recommendations?
So they have a number of interesting recommendations. They have recommendations, for example, on the provision of childcare. They did a specific focus on childcare. And they have various ideas about how to improve childcare, how to make it more accessible and affordable for all families as a big part of reducing that care burden. There are various other measures that would be coming out more, especially if we had a national time use survey.
I'm just wondering, because you know the 5 R's that you mentioned, it feels like it's about a change in the cultural systems, the cultural values, the patriarchy even. Is it something that can be changed through economic policy?
Economic policy can help. And let me put it this way, you know, unfortunately societies don't value things which don't have a high monetary reward. So we will say that a primary school teacher is not really worth as much as this fancy financier, because that one earns more. Whereas in terms of social value, the primary school teacher is much more important. So I think the economic policies can certainly push for a wider recognition.
Is this a conversation that India is also having?
Yes, but we are even much, much worse than Malaysia. We are so far behind. Because in India, the problem is not just that the market undervalues the pay, but that even the government undervalues the pay, the care workers. So we are running public health and nutrition systems on the back of local women who are not even treated as proper workers. They're called voluntary and volunteers, and they're paid an honorarium, which is often like 1/3 or 1/4 of the minimum wage. And the reason they can get away with this is because of the whole idea that there's all this unpaid work that the women do. Even the government is using this to run their public health and nutrition systems, which is shocking. And which perpetuates that wage gap that I mentioned.
I mean, this is all, I was just about to say, you know, it feeds into the inequality, breeding the gap with gender inequality as well. I mean, where do you see the major dislocations happening if this is allowed to continue in a country, say, like India?
Well, first of all, it massively perpetuates gender divides, and it makes them much harder to actually even get markets to value what women do. It forces women into the worst kinds of fragile and low-paid kinds of occupations. The fact that they have to do so much unpaid work, we have a very low paid work participation rate, now as low as 18%, because so many women are doing unpaid work at home, fetching water, fetching fuel wood, in addition to all of the other care activities that everybody knows about. And so if you don't recognize this, you're not even going to do something to reduce all that. Quite apart from the welfare benefits and the social effects of better equality, you're losing out as an economy. We could have so much more economic growth if women could go out for paid work. We could have a better educated, more healthy population if we provided more care activities with proper trained workers with proper wages. We would have a better, more sound economy all through if we actually recognized this huge significance of care and rewarded it properly.
What is the Indian government doing in terms of the role of the state in the Indian economy, especially in its efforts to deal with this inequality, to deal with poverty eradication? I mean, it's a wide topic, but I'd like to get your sense very quickly of the role of the state in this.
So mostly this government is actually adding to the problem by, as I said, relying on these underpaid workers whom they don't even call workers, without any workers' rights, by not providing proper care services, by not even enabling the conditions for women to actually reduce their unpaid labor. There are some small schemes which could be of benefit. There is a scheme to provide piped gas or cylinder gas to households so they don't have to go looking for fuel wood. But it's too small relative to the need and relative to the massive amounts of time that women actually do spend. Overall, I would say that this is really a government that it's not just patriarchal in its own self, it relies on patriarchy to undertake a whole bunch of policies which assume the existence of all this unpaid household labor that they can take for granted.
All right, we're going to come back and continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Astro AWANI. Thank you for staying with us. I'm Melissa Idris. With me, Professor Jayati Ghosh from Nehru University in India. We were talking a little bit about the Indian economy and the inequality there. I want to get a sense from you. Are you optimistic about the Indian economy? And I have to say that, you know, this is all in the backdrop of what's happening globally, in the global economy. Also in the backdrop of how Modi's policies twin with the politics of Hindu nationalism. So given all that and everything that we've discussed just before the break, are you optimistic about the future of the Indian economy?
So I would say I am long run optimistic because I think there's so much potential and there's, I mean, India has so many capabilities eventually. Short run, I'm pessimistic. I'm very pessimistic, short run.
What makes you pessimistic?
So here's the thing. We had this major boom in the economy from about 2002 till about, you know, actually 2012. So a decade of major boom. But it was a boom that didn't generate employment and was massively increasing inequality. So even in the big boom period, employment grew by less than 2% per annum, when our labor force is growing and we have a younger and younger labor force.
Okay.
And with low women's participation and everything, as I mentioned. Since then, in fact, and of course inequality in both wealth and income increased hugely over this period. Since then, we've had two major things which have completely destabilized the economy. And already in that period of boom, we didn't get enough mass consumption demand growing because wages, employment were not growing enough, right? But then in 2016, November, we got demonetization, which was an amazing move to basically declare 86% of the value of currency in circulation no good. Overnight.
Yes.
You can't use it. Now, this was like a death blow to the informal economy because they were all cash driven. And new money didn't come back into the system for about 8 months. So there was just no money. People could not buy anything. And as a result, all kinds of informal sector collapsed. People lost their jobs, they lost livelihood, traders didn't know what to do. I mean, it was a real mess, okay? And this mess lasted for a while, okay? And then when they were just about struggling, the government decided to introduce a goods and services tax, which was very badly introduced. It was a very complicated scheme. It was designed badly and it was implemented even worse, in a sense like the demonetization. And that did another blow to the informal sector. So 85% of the workforce is in informal activities. They are now, some of them are getting wages half of what they were getting before 2016.
Wow.
And so obviously they have no demand. Now this went on for a while and the government kept pretending that it's not there and kept providing GDP figures which now everyone pretty much realizes are cooked. And now all this lack of demand has finally hit the formal sector. So now people have stopped buying everything. Automobiles, the sales have been falling for 4 months, all kinds of vehicles, even two-wheelers, biscuits people are not buying. All kinds of things are simply no longer being purchased at every level. To the point where, apparently I didn't know this before, the best indicator of a recession is the sale of male underwear.
Male underwear?
Globally, I'm told.
Why,
this is the
why
best.
is that
Now,
the best
I don't know
indicator
why,
of recession?
but that's an indicator of recession. And in India, male underwear sales have collapsed.
When men stop buying underwear, we know we're in trouble.
Yes. And so here we are now in a deep economic
Recession.
slowdown.
Slowdown.
Technically a recession is when GDP falls for two
For 2
quarters.
quarters.
We don't even know what's happening with GDP because the numbers really don't make sense.
Okay.
But we know employment has fallen. We have lost 15 million employment in the last 7 years. We know that wages are falling. We know that demand is coming down. We know that factories are unable to sell output. Many of them are laying off workers. So it's a recession by every other indicator.
Well, what is the sentiment on the ground? When you talk to people, is there a sense of economic anxiety that is translating to everyday life?
Deep economic anxiety. And that's another reason why then you cut spending. Because you don't know whether you'll have your job, even if you have an income, so you cut spending. There are families that have gone back to 2 meals a day. There are children who are no longer getting milk with their morning meal. At all kinds of ways in which families are cutting back. It's not just the male underwear.
Right.
They are cutting back in all kinds of ways.
Okay.
And obviously that then affects the consumer sentiment, affects investor sentiment, and then nobody wants to invest because you're not selling the stuff you've produced already.
Sure. So you said that this is, you're pessimistic in the short run. So what do you think is next then? What is the next stage of this economic
So here's the thing.
slowdown?
I would be less pessimistic if I felt that the government was going to do the things that are required.
Okay. What's required, Professor?
Well, clearly this is a problem of a demand collapse. So provide demand. We have a rural employment guarantee. Spend much more money on that. Provide many more rural jobs. All of these workers will go out and spend all that money. Okay. And that will create lots of positive multiplier effects. We underprovide health, education, nutrition, sanitation. Spend lots more money on that. Again, that's very employment intensive. It will create lots of jobs. If the government simply filled the vacancies in all of these sectors, that would create 7 million jobs overnight. If they just filled the vacancies. 7 million jobs, all these workers would actually have incomes, they would go out and spend. You would get sentiment improving. So in the immediate short run, it's very clear what needs to be done. The government has to go out there and spend because nobody else is spending.
Right. So is there political will to do that? I mean, in the idea of fiscal spending in this, fiscal policy in this direction, is there political will for that?
Absolutely not. There is complete denial, first of all, that there's a problem. And then even if you're willing to do something, all you're willing to do is what are called supply side measures. So the government says, okay, we'll make the banks lend out more credit. No one's taking the credit because they don't want to invest, okay? Or the government says, we'll give the companies a more tax cut. They've just given a big tax cut to corporations. Again, that's not going to revive investment. So the government is refusing to accept the problem for what it is. That's the reason I'm so short-run pessimistic, because this can just get worse and worse.
Okay.
What could be a short-run cyclical slump could just descend into a stagnation.
Well, we've often talked about India as a financial, economic superpower, but I'm trying to get the sense from you whether that position, that prestige, seems to be in jeopardy at the moment.
So here's the thing. I think India has huge potential, as I said, and it is already. We have so many people. We are such a large economy. So you can't wish us away, right? We're not going to disappear from the scene.
Yes.
But I do believe that even the past trajectory is under serious threat. And this is something which, in fact, even now, more and more domestic and foreign investors are realizing. Everybody's waiting to see, okay, are they going to do something to revive the economy?
Okay, well, the world is watching.
The world is watching, and it's really time that the government got its act together and did what is so self-evidently the thing to do.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but I've had such a wonderful time talking to you.
And I've enjoyed it too. Thank you.
I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for Astro AWANI. Thank you for watching.